So one question we have is, what are some strategies people can use to do physical activities, even when experiencing some symptoms like low energy or a lack of interest or a negative emotion? And I would like to start with Dr. Young for her thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where so many people are at right now. The pandemic continuing has really taken a toll, of course. I'm sure Catherine can tell us more specifically, but on our mental health and on feelings of just lethargy. And so I would suggest practical strategies would be starting small and setting something specific with others. So that might be, I am going to take 10 deep breaths and stand up out of my work chair for 1 minute before every meeting, or one time at lunchtime, or at the beginning of each day. I'm going to do a sun salutation if I practice yoga, or I'm going to bend my knees and do 10 squats, whatever it is, something that is manageable for your current situation. And so if you're working from home, those are all the things I just thought of, because lots of people are working from home right now. But it could be, of course, different on your circumstances. Knowing that you can do, like, if you have complete control of what the behavior you just suggested, or if you set a behavior that you have complete control over, then ticking a little check mark off every day reminds yourself that, oh yeah, I can do it, I did do it. And that idea of self-confidence or self-efficacy, like Catherine alluded to, that builds, right? So 10 deep breaths might not feel like enough right now, but after a week or two of doing that, maybe it's like, okay, well, that does feel good. I actually feel like I'm in charge, and I'm moving my body. I do want to take it up. I want to do 20, or I want to do whatever it is. And that's honestly how we achieve great things. We take small steps.
Thank you for that. Yes, definitely taking those little steps that would get us to the greater goal is a great place to start. And you've talked about so much, the self-compassion, the awareness, and the accountability. The honest accountability is really going to be helpful as well. Thank you for that. The next question we have is for Dr. Tarnopolsky. And could you talk a little bit more about your work with exercise therapy for your patients with severe genetic diseases, and maybe some of the myths around exercise that exist for that group?
Sure, that's an excellent question. So muscular dystrophy in particular is a disorder that 26 years ago, when I started my practice, our patients were encouraged not to exercise, and they thought that they'd be tearing their muscle and causing more damage. The downside, of course, is that for so many folks who are weak to begin with, you're not moving very much, so you're not burning calories. And so what would happen is they would gain an inordinate amount of weight. And, if you put a 50-pound backpack on anyone and try and get out of a chair, it's a challenge. So a lot of folks were ending up in a wheelchair, or just having more and more impairments in their daily activities just from the sheer weight gain, because they weren't doing anything. And then you throw that on top of the fact that we now know that with properly executed exercise, we actually can improve and maintain strength. It's very well documented, and a good friend and colleague, John Vissing in Copenhagen, has done lots of research in this area to show the benefits. Just as a little example, we have a paper that will be coming out in 2 months where we had patients with myotonic muscular dystrophy. And one lady was so weak, she lasted 34 seconds on a bike with zero resistance when we started. At the end of 4 months of careful and gradually increasing intensity and duration, she could go 3 times a week for half an hour. She lost 3.5 kilos of body fat. Her fitness went up 31%, and she was able to climb stairs better, walk, etc. And that's just one of many examples. Even for boys with the severe Duchenne dystrophy, the only boy I've seen who is still walking at over 20 years of age, didn't take any steroids or any other drug, but from the time he was 4, his grandfather, who was a yoga master, took him under his wing and would spend 2 hours a day with him, stretching, doing yoga, and then doing some cycling. And he's in university now in 2nd year. keep in mind with that disease, most people on average are in a wheelchair at age 11. So they're just, you've got to be sensitive to, again, what are their strengths. You've got to give them, as we do with all children, and I think also for adults, to show people a smorgasbord of activities so that you can find what works best for you. Because if someone told me to swim every day, I'd give up on exercise. But if you get me out running or cross-country skiing 7 days a week is not enough for me. And I think the same is true of older adults, the same is true of young children, and for those with various neurolocomotor disabilities, not just genetic muscle disease, but arthritis. We know severe osteoarthritis folks benefit from it. So I can't think of a disorder where people won't benefit from appropriately prescribed exercise. It's got to be fun, and it's got to be done on a regular basis, and people will reap the benefits.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, like you said, finding the fun in that physical activity goes a long way. I'm kind of the opposite of you, where if someone told me to run, I would not want to at all. I would rather like go kickboxing or something that seems like high intensity versus just run.
And that's the beauty of exercise. There are thousands of different types of exercise.
Exactly.
And you just got to find what you like.
Exactly. Oh, that's great advice. Awesome. So the next question is towards Dr. Savison, and it is, are there differences between populations when it comes to physical activities' impact on mental health? And when you talk about that, maybe could you touch upon accessibility of these different forms of engaging in physical activities for people that think that, you know, that's the bottleneck for them, is where are they going to do it? How are they going to do it wherever they're located?
Yeah, so what we know is, you know, there's still a lot of research that needs to happen in terms of understanding the nuances around the actual underlying reasons why exercise and physical activity work for mental health across a number of different populations. What we do know is in the studies that include people of different identities in a variety of capacities, different illnesses, we tend to see the benefits of mental health from exercise. So there doesn't seem to be a group that doesn't, you know, benefit from exercise. What we do see is the challenges lie in some mental illnesses where the challenge lies in getting started. So, you know, lack of motivation, for example, is a core symptom of depression. And so how do you start to exercise if you're experiencing overwhelming lack of motivation and anhedonia and most things in your day? You know, we just heard fun is the core element of exercise. So how, if you don't find fun or an interest or enjoyment or motivation, how do you start to engage in exercise? And it's really critical to think about. I think what we've tried to do here today is dispel the myth that exercise or physical activity is just, you know, we've used running as a lot of examples, but it's not just running, biking, swimming, weights. There's thousands of different movement related behaviors that you can engage in regardless of ability, regardless of location, regardless of living condition. And so it's about finding the activity that's accessible to you, to always focus on changing up the environment, change the context, change the type of movement that you're doing, you know, do little bouts. So start really small and build it, not focusing on big times of day that you have to move, and focus on really small bouts throughout the day instead of one big one. Oftentimes it's hard for people to think, you know, for a certain amount of time, I don't have that in my day. But if you're doing smaller bouts, it's really important. We know that, again, just smaller movements, changing the type, changing the frequency, making it more enjoyable for you. There's so many different elements of exercise. You know, we've talked about frequency, we've talked about type, we've talked about intensity, we've talked about where you engage in exercise. So even just there, you can change a lot about what you're doing in your day to find the things that you enjoy and find the things that you benefit from. So, you know, really there aren't many constraints when you know, you take your own context into heart and focus on just small things that you can do to move, especially for mental health. You know, we do see those benefits. So I think I answered your question, but
Yes, you did. Thank you. You definitely answered the question. And even just based on your answer, I keep thinking about like my personal experiences, especially when the pandemic hit, where it was just all uncertainty. It didn't matter what the question was, it was just so much uncertainty. And so I started walking outside for my sanity. I would just go outside, put on a podcast, and just, get lost in the podcast that I was listening to. But, life happens and I broke my leg. So the first thing that happened to me was I can't go walk. I can't do anything. And I felt really down for a little bit. But then it was like, okay, maybe I can just go outside and take 2 steps when I could actually like go on crutches, like just go outside, feel the fresh air, come back, and then tried to start increasing what I was doing. So being able to be compassionate with myself that I couldn't walk, because it was so unreasonable that I was mad that I couldn't walk and go do the exercise. But that's how I felt. And, thinking about it and then just going, here's what you can do. So just do this in the interim until the point where you are back to near 100% was really helpful for me. So we've got another question for Dr. Jung, and it says, a senior living alone has fallen, tripped in an outing, and since then stopped going out. How can I encourage them to go out, or should they be encouraged to do this?
Yeah, and I think so personal stories are going to come in here. My mom, who is 78, and has severe osteoarthritis, kyphosis, the whole bit, and she had a fall and broke a lot of bones. Long story short, this is the perfect scenario. Maybe this is my mom, I don't know. But anyways, the encouragement is, yeah, you need to keep moving, because if you don't move it, you lose it. That idea about hypertrophy that Mark talked about, the idea of balance, regulation, but for her, it's independence. And so the kicker is that insecurity has arisen, and refusal to use a walker is also there. So how do you feel safe? How do you encourage others who don't feel safe to keep moving, knowing that if they lessen their physical movement, then the problem perpetuates and exacerbates? And so for her and like many others, I'm sure it's about increasing movement in where she feels safe. So physiotherapist exercises in the home, working on balance, working on strength and mobility, working on actions that can make you feel more secure if you're living in an icier wintry conditions in Canada or anywhere. And then I'm not sure if people can see the chat here, but Dr. Tarnopolsky's comments are also fabulous in that, there needs to be some physiological checkups with anybody who's in that situation, just to assess if there's any underlying conditions that we need to be aware of that are causing the fall. I'm a big proponent of using aids to assist that individual, or similar to your story, Priya, that, what can I do in the meantime? It's not that I'm forcing my mom to use a walker for the rest of her life, just until it's not icy and the bones are healed.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great story that you shared with that personal experience. And just touching upon the insecurities, that is so real and such it was a huge component for me, because I felt so insecure to walk outside. And it was about the safety. All I could think of is, if I fall, no one is around me, what is going to happen? Like, how would I be able to deal with that? So finding a safe place to then practice those little things that will help you to get to the next level in your recovery or your rehab, that really does go a long way. Thank you for that. So we've got another question, and I will address this to Dr. Tarnopolsky. And it says, do you see differences between access to exercise opportunities in rural versus urban communities?
Yeah, so in the rural community, often there can be limitations, for example, with no sidewalks. I have a home where I work, which is urban, and I'm up here in a rural setting. And I can tell you there was a huge debate when they went from the smaller garbage containers and the recycling containers that you could put in your car and drop off at the end of your driveway. And people were freaking out when they went to these big, huge containers that you have to roll all the way up. So for us, it's a 300-meter trek out to the edge of the road, and there's no sidewalks at all. So you go up and down the road here, and you're likely to get killed from people whipping around on these backcountry roads. So that's one of the issues, but there's ways around it. So in a rural community, you just have to be a little bit more creative, for lack of a better term, and find, Pretty River Trails, beautiful place to walk, just amazing. The other issue is sometimes activity centers. Certainly the YMCA has done a huge benefit to so many people in terms of access to safe and varied equipment for both endurance and resistance type of activity. And yet those are really only in, centers that are probably 40,000 people or above. And so those can be some of the issues. And certainly there's data that when COVID hit, the biggest group of people who decreased their physical activity were those who regularly went to a gym setting. And so what we always encourage is make sure you've got options at home. So when my wife and I, many, you can tell how old I am, probably 30, 40 years ago, when we had young kids, because of one of us had to stay home with the children, we set up a small gym, and it wasn't very expensive. It was like $800 for a reclining bike, some weights, and one person always stayed home and did their workout. And I think there's many ways to be creative, especially now what we've seen with the pandemic, so that you can work out at home, either if you're an isolated rural community or at home without access to the gym and other places to go. Just got to be creative.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that advice. Yeah, being creative and, mixing it into the things that you like that is very much a key component from what all of the panelists have told us today is you need to love what you're doing. It's much easier to exercise if you actually enjoy it. And the motivations behind that are positive for you and uplifting to let you do the work and do it consistently, whatever consistently looks like. So I had one more question, and this question was going to Dr. Sabiston, and it was about when you talked about being compassionate to yourself. So how do you balance that compassion versus complacency, right? Where now you're just making excuses, but you think you're just being compassionate to yourself. We do all have things that happen to us, but sometimes we may just think of anything not to be the reason why we stick to, the journey towards the goal that we have when it comes to physical activity. How can we identify that line of complacency versus compassion?
Yeah, it's a great question. The research in self-compassion, and Dr. Jung could also weigh in on this, but the research in self-compassion more generally always has that balance between complacency and self-compassion, especially in the context of exercise and physical activity. One of the key elements of guiding along that balance is intentionality. So, making sure that there's an intention to your actions and that you don't fall into, more of an implicit, sort of just doing it for the sake of doing it. That's the core element that sort of separates this complacency from self-compassion, is an intentional, almost driven, goal-oriented focus on yourself. And without that, it can certainly become, more implicit and complacent, for lack of another term, in that divide. But I would also welcome Dr. Jung to answer on that question as well.
Yes, Alicia.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say one quick thing, and that's it's an assumption, but when we look at the data, we find this cool effect happening, and this is some work I'm doing on self-compassion and exercise adherence with a colleague at University of Manitoba, Dr. Strachan, and what we found is that when we teach people to be more self-compassionate, their frequency of exercise throughout 6 months actually increases, and then as an offshoot of that, they actually become more fit than individuals who go through a program but aren't taught self-compassion skills. So we see this opposite, where you say to people, be kind to yourself. Listen to what your body really feels, and what you find joy in, like you said, Priye. And what happens is they end up exercising more. They find the joy in the movement, like everyone's spoken of here today. And because they're not giving that harsh whip to themselves, if you will, they tend to exercise more frequently. So it's almost this opposite reaction or happening when I think we get this knee-jerk reaction that when you suggest things like being kind to yourself, people think, oh, you're just being soft. And I really think the opposite happens when it comes to exercise adherence.
Awesome. Thank you for adding to that. Dr. Tarnopolsky, do you want to add to that as well before we close off?
Whoops. Yeah, I mean, I think, what was I thinking during all of that? Certainly, when one exercises, the other thing too is the incredible feeling that you get afterwards. And I think about my dog. She has a short-term memory, and when she comes back, she's so happy afterwards. It's just incredible. But unlike humans, she doesn't think before she goes out again that she's going to have that great feeling. And I think that just the feeling you get afterwards just makes you feel so fantastic. And I think once people do things that they enjoy, that feeling just becomes a positive feedback cycle and just encourages a fun enjoyment and compliance. So people are more likely to do it.
Awesome. Thank you for that insight. Thank you again to all of the panelists, Dr. Tarnopolsky, Dr. Yoon, and Dr. Savastin. I definitely learned so much today that I'm going to take and execute with all of the goals that I now have. And the plan is to be kind to myself and actually set achievable goals and make sure my motives are actually in the right place.